Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really complex and often, well, misunderstood topic, state support here in the UK.
That's right.
You've sent us a really fascinating mix of sources, all trying to shed some light on who actually gets this support and maybe how the stories we hear, in the media shape how we understand it, or perhaps misunderstand it.
Yeah, there's quite a range. We've got that report from Disability Rights UK focusing on benefit sanctions disparities.
Right.
Then there's a very data-heavy piece aiming to debunk some common myths about welfare, particularly from a far-right perspective, it seems.
Okay.
And a historical look at media bias stretching way back, plus the official government stats on universal credit and overall state support by ethnicity.
So our mission today is really to unpack all of this, try and get to the statistical facts, and see how public perception might be getting, well, skewed.
Exactly. It's a good mix. The specific issues like sanctions, the big picture spending myths, the historical context for why people might believe certain things, and then the official numbers themselves.
Okay, let's dive right in then. One of the most striking things right off the bat comes from that Disability Rights UK report. It highlights a really big difference in who's getting hit with benefit sanctions.
Yeah, it really does. They're citing DWP figures, and according to those, Black universal credit claimants are 58% more likely to be sanctioned than white claimants.
58%, wow.
Yeah.
And it was even higher for some groups.
That's right. For those from mixed ethnic groups, it jumps to 72% more likely. And Asian claimants are also slightly higher, about 5% more likely.
So what do these sanctions actually mean? They're applied if people don't meet certain work-related conditions.
Exactly. Failing to meet work-related conditions. And the report really emphasizes the consequences. They can be incredibly serious, pushing people towards food banks, hitting mental and physical health hard, causing real financial difficulty.
And it's not just Disability Rights UK flagging this, is it?
No, the Black Equity Organization apparently sees these numbers as, well, pretty clear evidence of systemic bias. They actually use the term racial discrimination operating within job centers.
Strong words. Does anyone suggest what should be done?
Well, the Public Law Project, mentioned in the report, has actually called for the DWP to really investigate this properly, to look into potential discrimination in the sanctions process itself, find any bias, and, get rid of it.
Okay, now here's something that really stood out to me from that report. Disability Rights UK says this risk, this disproportionate impact on minority ethnic claimants, it wasn't exactly a surprise.
No, apparently not. An equality impact assessment for universal credit way back in 2011.
2011, so well over a decade ago.
Yeah, it actually flagged this as a potential issue back then, which does make you wonder, why more wasn't done to head this off.
Right, and the number of people being sanctioned isn't small either.
No, it's quite sobering. In the 2023-24 period alone, nearly 440,000 universal credit claimants were sanctioned.
440,000.
Yeah. And Disability Rights UK also points out, referencing the Work and Pensions Committee, that's MPs, that there's actually a lack of solid proof that these sanctions even work effectively.
Yes.
In terms of helping people find jobs or increase hours.
So their effectiveness is questionable.
It seems so. And worse, there's actually a growing amount of evidence suggesting they can be actively harmful, especially perhaps for people with disabilities.
Okay, so that's a really concerning picture on the sanctions front. Let's switch gears a bit now to that source challenging some common beliefs about who gets welfare overall, the debunking far-right welfare myths analysis. What were the big statistical takeaways there?
Well, one of the most, I suppose, counterintuitive findings, given some narratives, is that white Britons actually make up the vast majority of universal credit claimants.
Right, that does seem to go against what you sometimes hear.
And another crucial point the analysis makes is about the sheer scale and, importantly, the distribution of the total welfare spend.
Okay.
So in 2025, the total UK welfare bill was about $316 billion. That's around 10% of GDP.
Which sounds like a lot.
It is a lot, but here's the key part. Pensioner benefits alone made up $174.9 billion of that. That's 55% of the total.
Over half.
Exactly. And the state pension by itself was $145.6 billion, so 46% of the whole welfare budget.
Wow. So working age benefits are the ones usually focused on.
They totaled $141.2 billion, which is 45%. So, slightly less than pensioner benefits. It really reframes where the bulk of the money is going.
It really does. So often the conversation seems centered on working age support. Okay, so when we look specifically at universal credit claimants, Who are they, according to this analysis?
Right, so using 2025 figures, it states that white Britons were the largest group by far, 76.2%, which is 5.7 million people.
76.2%. Okay, and the other groups?
Asian claimants made up 10.4%, that's about 780,000. Black claimants were 6.0%, around 450,000. People identifying as other were 4.4%, or 330,000, and mixed ethnicity claimants were 2.9%, about 220,000.
So the data seems pretty clear there. White Britons are the majority.
Yes. And the source argues that these proportions broadly align with the general population demographics, suggesting ethnic minorities aren't actually overrepresented in these claims.
And it also mentions something about rules affecting migrants.
Ah, yes, the no recourse to public funds rules. It points out that many migrants are legally barred from claiming a lot of benefits anyway.
Okay. So what does the analysis say is driving welfare demand then, if not immigration?
Well, it argues the real pressures come from things like our aging population, hence the huge pension costs, plus low wages, meaning people need top-ups, and the ongoing housing crisis driving up housing benefit costs, not primarily immigration.
It even made a comparison with another country, didn't it? Germany.
Yeah, that was an interesting point. Germany has higher levels of immigration than the UK, apparently, but actually spends a lower percentage of its GDP on welfare, 8.4%, versus the UK's 10.6%.
Which definitely challenges that simple link people sometimes make between immigration and welfare costs.
It does seem to, based on that comparison. Now, this leads us nicely into the historical context from the media bias and hyperbole source. Because, how did these potentially skewed perceptions take hold?
Right. This source traces a really long pattern, doesn't it? Like a century of media outlets scapegoating minority groups regarding welfare. Can you give us some key examples?
Sure. It starts way back in the early 1900s. Apparently, newspapers often called Jewish refugees alien paupers.
Even though, as you mentioned, evidence suggested they used welfare less.
Exactly. Then, jump to the 1950s, and you had Caribbean migrants who, remember, were actively recruited to help rebuild Britain after the war, being portrayed in some papers as welfare parasites.
This is pretty shocking seeing that history laid out. And the pattern just continued.
It seems so. The source talks about the 1970s, with some media depicting Asian families as scrounger families, often ignoring data that showed high employment rates for certain groups. And then in the 1990s, the focus shifted to asylum seekers, frequently labeled bogus claimants.
Even though, at the time, they were often legally banned from working and claiming most benefits.
Precisely. It's quite chilling to see this century-long pattern of, misrepresentation.
Yeah. No wonder, then, that YouGov data mentioned in the source shows a majority of people today still overestimate minority welfare use. These narratives clearly stick.
They seem to have had a lasting impact, and it's not just historical, is it? The source points to more recent examples, too.
Like what?
Well, it mentions how some outlets, like GB News in 2023, might focus heavily on relatively small increases in universal credit payments,
Okay.
while pretty much ignoring the vast sums being spent on things like the state pension. It's about framing. And it also highlights the use of anecdotal evidence, like the TV show Benefit Street, which could paint a very skewed, unrepresentative picture of who a typical claimant is.
So it's selective reporting, essentially. Highlighting certain things, downplaying others.
Exactly that. And misleading headlines, too, like ones implying recent migrants are claiming billions, but often failing to clarify that many included in those figures might be naturalized citizens who've been paying taxes here for years.
Right.
And as you mentioned, that YouGov data from 2024 found 58% of Britons overestimate welfare claims by minority ethnic groups. That's a significant majority.
Was there also something about social housing in there? Another common narrative?
Yes, the idea of migrants jumping the queue. The source directly challenges this with data from Shelter from 2023 showing that actually 72% of social housing goes to white UK-born citizens.
72%. So again, a big gap between perception and the numbers.
A very big gap. It seems clear these media narratives, both historical and current, really do shape public opinion, often in ways the data just doesn't back up.
Okay, so we've seen the sanctions disparity, challenged some spending myths, and looked at media influence. Now let's get into the really detailed official government statistics. The gov.uk data covering 2018 to 2021, broken down by ethnicity. This gives a granular view, right?
Yes, very granular across different types of support. So first off, the big picture. In the 3 years up to March 2021, overall, 51% of UK families received some form of state support. Just over half.
Okay. Any difference by ethnicity in that overall figure?
Yes. Perhaps surprisingly for some, white British families were actually the most likely to receive any state support at 54%. The least likely were Chinese families at 25%.
That is interesting. What about when you separate out different types of benefits, like income-related ones?
Right. So income-related benefits, these are things like housing cost help dependent on your current income. Here, the picture changes. Families from Bangladeshi and Black ethnic groups were most likely to receive these, both at 24%.
And the least likely for income-related.
That was Chinese and Indian families, both down at just 8%.
Okay. And the other main category, non-income-related benefits, things like the state pension, presumably.
Exactly. Benefits often based on things like age or contributions. Here again, white British families were the most likely to receive these at 51%.
51%, likely driven heavily by the state pension recipients.
Very likely, yes, given the age demographics. And again, Chinese families were least likely for these non-income related benefits at 23%.
So it really looks like different ethnic groups have different patterns of receiving different kinds of support.
Precisely. The data also looked at tax credits specifically. Here, families from Bangladeshi at 18% and Pakistani, 17% ethnic groups were most likely to receive them. Chinese families were least likely, again, only 4%.
Can we break it down even further, like specific benefits within those categories?
Yes, the data did that too for 2018-2021. For non-income related, a key finding was that 27% of white British families received the state pension much higher than other groups, whereas Bangladeshi, 34%, and Pakistani, 30% families were most likely to receive child benefit.
Okay, and for specific income-related benefits?
Bangladeshi and Black families showed the highest likelihood of receiving council tax reduction, 15% and 18% respectively, and also housing benefit, both around 14%.
It's complex, but it paints a picture of varied reliance. Did the data show any overall trends over time?
Yes. It noted that between 2009 and 2021, the percentage of families receiving state support actually decreased across all ethnic groups. That's an important longer-term context.
Right. Okay, one last piece of data then. The very latest Universal Credit Ethnicity Stats from April 2024. What's the snapshot there?
So as of April 2024, and this is crucial, it's based only on those claimants who provided their ethnicity data 77.5% identified as white.
Still the vast majority.
Yes. Then Asian British were 9.5%, Black African Caribbean Black British were 5.8%, other was 4.3%, and mixed multiple ethnicity was 2.9%.
And you mentioned a caveat.
Yes, a really important one. This data is based on only about 75% of claimants providing the information. It's optional. So the government advises caution when interpreting these specific percentages.
Understood. Still, any noticeable change for the previous year?
A very slight one. Compared to April 2023, the proportion identifying as white decreased slightly from 78.8%, while the proportion identifying as Asian British increased a bit from 8.4%. But again, keeping that data completion caveat in mind.
Okay, so bringing this all together now, after diving into all these different sources, the sanctions data, the myth-busting analysis, the media history, the official stats, what are the main takeaways?
Oh, I think the clearest thing is that the reality is far more nuanced, far more complex than the simple narratives often suggest.
Right.
We see white Britons are the majority of overall welfare recipients, especially when you factor in big non-income related benefits like the state pension. But at the same time, there are these really significant disparities in other areas, most notably the much higher risk faced by Black and mixed ethnicity claimants when it comes to benefit sanctions.
Yeah, that was stark.
And we've seen how media narratives, both historically and today, seem to have fueled misconceptions by focusing disproportionately on minority claims, often ignoring that huge chunk of spending on pensioners, and just generally not reflecting the actual demographics of who receives support.
And the official stats just add more layers to that, showing different patterns of support across different groups and different benefit types.
Exactly. It's not a simple picture at all.
So what does all this mean for you, our listener? It really feels like we've uncovered some pretty significant gaps between the statistical facts of state support in the UK and some of the stories or beliefs that are out there.
It really does. It underscores just how important it is to, look critically at the information we get, maybe question the narratives, and try to find the underlying data where possible.
And it raises big questions too, doesn't it? About fairness, about equity in the systems that are supposed to be providing support.
Absolutely. Vital questions.
This has been a really, really illuminating deep dive. Thank you for walking us through all that complexity.
My pleasure. It's certainly a lot to digest.
It is. And for you listening, maybe something to think about. Considering everything we've discussed, how could we foster a more accurate, maybe less biased public conversation around welfare policy? And what part can you play, perhaps, in challenging misleading narratives and seeking out the facts for yourself? Definitely some food for thought there. Join us next time for another deep dive.